Claire's entire body was shaking so hard she thought her bones might snap. She sat on that freezing metal bench in the bus shelter, rain hammering down like the sky wanted to drown her, her lips turning blue, her wedding ring still on her finger, and she realized something terrifying. She was dying, not from the cold, though that was bad enough. She was dying because the man she'd loved for 7 years had just shoved her out of her own house, locked the door in her face, and screamed at her like she was the criminal, all because she'd caught him in bed with another woman. And now, as the rain poured and the world blurred into nothing, Claire heard it. A rumble, deep, powerful, the kind of sound that vibrates in your chest before your ears catch it. She looked up. A massive motorcycle rolled to a stop right in front of her, headlight cutting through the storm like a searchlight. The engine died, and Claire's heart stopped, because the man climbing off that bike was the most terrifying thing she'd ever seen. 6'4" of muscle, scars, and ink, with a leather cut that read, Iron King's President. Everyone in the city knew that name, and they knew his. Bear, the monster every mother warned her daughter about. He stepped into the shelter, towering over her, and Claire knew this was it. This was how her story ended. But then he spoke. "You're turning blue. Now, let me take you back to where this nightmare actually started, because believe it or not, Claire's worst day began with her trying to do something nice." Claire Matthews was 32 years old, living in Portland, Oregon, and her biggest problem, the one she didn't even know she had, was that she loved a man who didn't deserve her. His name was Mark, and for 7 years, she'd built her entire life around making him happy, and anyway, that's exactly what she was trying to do when everything fell apart. She left work early that Tuesday afternoon, canceled an important meeting with her boss, and stopped by Golden Dragon to pick up Mark's favorite meal, orange chicken, fried rice, and those fortune cookies he always insisted on opening first. She was smiling as she drove home, already imagining his face when he saw the surprise, because Mark had been distant lately, staying out late, coming home exhausted, and Claire thought maybe this would remind him why they'd fallen in love in the first place. But when she pulled into the driveway, her smile died. There was a car she didn't recognize parked in front of the garage, a sleek red sedan that definitely wasn't Mark's beat-up Honda. Claire's stomach tightened, but she told herself it was probably nothing, maybe a coworker, maybe someone from the gym, and she grabbed the takeout bag and headed inside. The front door was unlocked. She stepped into the house, and that's when she heard it. Laughter drifting down from upstairs, light and flirty, the kind of laughter that made her blood run cold because it wasn't hers. Claire stood at the bottom of the stairs, the plastic bag crinkling in her trembling hand, and every instinct screamed at her to turn around and leave. But she couldn't. She had to know. She climbed those stairs like a woman, walking toward her own execution, each step heavier than the last, and when she reached the bedroom door, she didn't knock. She just opened it, and her world exploded. Mark was in their bed, the bed they'd picked out together at IKEA 3 years ago, with a blonde woman Claire had never seen before, and they were tangled up in sheets that Claire had washed just that morning. For a moment, nobody moved. The blonde froze, eyes wide like a deer caught in headlights. Mark's face went from shock to something Claire had never seen before. Rage, pure, unfiltered rage, not at himself, at her. "What the hell, Claire?" he screamed, scrambling out of bed and grabbing his boxers. "You're spying on me now? You're crazy." Claire couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what was happening because this wasn't how this was supposed to go. He was supposed to apologize, supposed to beg for forgiveness, supposed to be the one in trouble. But Mark wasn't apologizing. He was yelling. "I told you I'd be working late today," he shouted, advancing on her, his face twisted with fury. "I told you not to come home early. You just can't trust me, can you? You just can't let me have anything." Claire stumbled backward, still clutching that stupid bag of Chinese food. "Mark, what are you? You ruined everything," he roared. "You're always doing this. Always checking up on me. Always making me feel like I'm some kind of criminal." The blonde was getting dressed now, smirking as she pulled on her jeans, clearly enjoying the show, and Claire felt like she was losing her mind because somehow, impossibly, Mark was flipping this entire situation around. He was making her the villain. "If you can't trust me," Mark snarled, grabbing her by the shoulders, "then you don't get to sleep here." And before Claire could process what was happening, he was shoving her, actually shoving her, backward down the hallway. Her shoulder hit the wall. The takeout bag fell from her hands, spilling orange chicken across the hardwood floor. "Mark, stop. Get out," he screamed. He shoved her down the stairs, and Claire barely caught herself on the railing, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. And then they were at the front door, and Mark was opening it wide. "You want to act crazy?" he hissed. "Go be crazy somewhere else." The rain was pouring outside, a biblical downpour that had turned the streets into rivers, but Mark didn't care. He shoved Claire out onto the porch, and slammed the door. The deadbolt clicked. Claire stood there in the rain, her clothes soaking through in seconds, staring at the door that had just locked her out of her own life. She didn't have her phone. It was on the kitchen counter. She didn't have her wallet. It was in her purse upstairs. She didn't have her keys. Mark had just locked her out with them. She had nothing but the clothes on her back and a wedding ring that suddenly felt like a shackle. Claire banged on the door. "Mark! Mark! Open the door!" Nothing. She banged harder, her fists bruising against the wood. "Please! It's pouring. Just let me get my phone." Inside, she heard laughter. His laughter. And hers. Claire's knees buckled, and she sank down onto the porch steps, rain hammering her skull, tears mixing with the water streaming down her face. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. But it was, and anyway, Claire realized something in that moment that broke her even more than the betrayal. She had nowhere to go. Her parents had died in a car accident 5 years ago. She had no siblings. Her friends were all Mark's friends, people she'd met through him, people who would take his side without question. She was alone, completely, utterly alone. Fam, if you're loving this story already, please subscribe, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to know how far this story is traveling. Now grab your popcorn, because what you're about to hear will question everything you think you know about people. If you've done that, let's begin. The rain didn't stop. If anything, it got worse, turning the world into a blur of gray and black, the kind of storm that made you believe the sky was genuinely angry. Claire didn't know where to go, so she just started walking. Her feet carried her down the street, past houses with warm lights glowing in the windows, past families eating dinner together, past lives that looked safe and whole and nothing like hers. She walked for blocks, shivering so hard her teeth chattered, her clothes plastered to her skin, and eventually she found a bus shelter and collapsed onto the metal bench. That's where the hypothermia started to set in. Claire's fingers went numb first, then her toes, and then this creeping coldness spread through her chest like ice water filling her lungs. Her lips turned blue, her vision started to blur, and she thought, with a strange sense of calm, that maybe this was how it ended. Not with some dramatic goodbye, but just with cold and rain and nobody noticing. Cars splashed past without stopping. People hurried by with umbrellas, not even glancing at the woman who looked like she was dying on that bench. And Claire realized that she'd spent 7 years making herself invisible to make Mark comfortable, and now, when she actually needed to be seen, nobody could. She closed her eyes, and that's when she heard it. That rumble, deep and powerful, cutting through the storm like a chainsaw through butter. Claire's eyes snapped open. A motorcycle, a massive, matte black beast of a machine, rolled to a stop directly in front of the shelter, its headlight blinding in the darkness. The engine cut out, and Claire's survival instincts, the ones that had been dormant for 7 years, suddenly screamed to life. Because the man climbing off that bike was the most terrifying thing she'd ever seen. He was huge, at least 6'4", maybe more, with shoulders so broad they blocked out the streetlight behind him. His arms were covered in tattoos, intricate designs that snaked up to his neck. His beard reached his chest, wild and untamed. And his face, God, his face looked like it had been carved from stone and then shattered and put back together wrong, scars crisscrossing his cheekbones and jaw. He wore a leather cut, soaking wet, and on the back, Claire could just make out the words, Iron Kings, President. Claire's blood turned to ice. She knew that name because everyone in Portland knew that name. The Iron Kings were the motorcycle club that ran the South Side, the one the news called a criminal enterprise, the one the cops were always investigating but could never actually take down. And this man, this giant, was their leader. They called him Bear, and Bear was walking straight toward her. Claire shrank back against the glass wall of the shelter, every muscle in her body screaming at her to run. But she couldn't because she was too cold, too weak, too broken. Bear ducked into the shelter, rain streaming off his shoulders. And up close, he was even more terrifying. Prison scars on his knuckles, a nose that had been broken at least 3 times, eyes that looked like they'd seen things that would make normal people lose their minds. Claire pressed herself against the wall, waiting for him to grab her, to hurt her, to finish what this nightmare of a day had started. But then he spoke. "You're turning blue," Bear said, and his voice wasn't a growl. It was calm, deep, almost gentle. Claire's teeth chattered so hard she could barely form words. "I'm fine." "You're not fine." Bear tilted his head, studying her like she was a puzzle he was trying to solve. "You're crying, you're freezing, and you're sitting in a bus shelter at midnight in a thunderstorm." His eyes dropped to her left hand, to the wedding ring she was still wearing. "Husband?" he asked. And that single word, that one simple question, cracked something inside Claire that she'd been holding together with duct tape and denial. A sob escaped before she could stop it. Then another. And then the whole story came pouring out. The surprise, the takeout, the bedroom, the blonde, Mark's screaming, the shoving, the door slamming in her face. "He threw me out," Claire whispered, her voice breaking. "Because I came home early. He said I broke the rules. He said I was crazy for not trusting him." Bear stared at her. For a long moment he didn't say anything, his face hard and unreadable, the face of a man who'd probably watched people beg for their lives without flinching. But then something shifted. His jaw tightened, his hands curled into fists, and his eyes, those terrifying scarred eyes, softened. Slowly, deliberately, Bear unzipped his heavy leather jacket. Claire flinched, certain this was it, certain he was about to do something terrible. But he didn't raise a hand. He didn't grab her. He took off the jacket, the symbol of his rank, the thing bikers treated like a second skin, and he wrapped it around Claire's shoulders. It was heavy and warm from his body, and it smelled like cedar and gasoline, and something unexpectedly clean, like laundry detergent. "It ain't right," Bear murmured, his voice rough. "To treat a woman like a stray dog." Claire looked up at him through her tears, at this giant, this monster, this man the world had taught her to fear. "Come on," Bear said. "Where?" Claire whispered. "My place. I got a guest room. And a heater." Every rational thought Claire had left told her this was insane, that she was about to walk into a trap, that men like this didn't help women like her without wanting something in return. But then again, the man she'd trusted for 7 years had just thrown her into a storm. So maybe rationality was overrated. "Why?" Claire asked, her voice barely audible over the rain. Bear paused, then he offered her his hand. Massive, scarred, tattooed, and somehow impossibly gentle. "Because I've done bad things, lady," he said quietly. "But I never left someone out in the cold." Claire looked at that hand. She looked at the rain pounding the pavement. She looked at the empty street, the locked door miles behind her, the life that had just collapsed like a house of cards. And she took his hand. Claire expected a trap. She expected to be taken to some grimy clubhouse filled with dangerous men, Zaza scattered on tables, weapons mounted on walls, and women who'd stopped fighting back a long time ago. She expected darkness. Instead, Bear took her to a small house tucked behind an auto shop on the outskirts of Portland, and when he opened the door and flicked on the light, Claire's entire worldview shifted. Because it wasn't a den of criminals. It was a home. A slightly cluttered, surprisingly cozy home that smelled like coffee and wood shavings and something baking in a slow cooker. Claire stood in the doorway, dripping rainwater onto the hardwood floor, staring at the scene in front of her like it was a hallucination. A 3-legged rescue dog, some kind of pit bull mix, lifted its head from a worn rug near the fireplace and wagged its tail so hard its entire body wiggled. Half-finished wood carving sat on the kitchen table, a deer mid-leap, an owl with intricate feathers, a woman's face with eyes that looked almost alive. Books were stacked on the windowsill, actual books with cracked spines and dog-eared pages. A flannel blanket was draped over a battered leather couch. And in the corner, a coffee maker that looked like it got daily use sat next to a collection of mismatched mugs. This wasn't what Claire had expected. Not even close. "Sit," Bear said, gesturing to the couch. Claire's legs were shaking so badly she almost collapsed onto the cushions. Bear's leather jacket still wrapped around her shoulders like a shield. Bear disappeared into the kitchen, and Claire heard the clink of ceramic, the whistle of a kettle, the sound of someone who actually knew how to make tea. He came back a moment later with a steaming mug and another blanket, this one thick and fleece-lined. Then he did something that made Claire's breath catch. He sat on the floor. This massive man, this 6'4" giant covered in scars and tattoos, folded his huge frame down onto the hardwood and positioned himself below her eye level. He's trying to make himself smaller, Claire realized. So I won't be scared. Something cracked inside her chest, but this time it wasn't grief. It was something else, something she couldn't quite name. "Drink," Bear said, his voice still that surprising calm. "You need to warm up from the inside." Claire wrapped her numb fingers around the mug and took a sip. Chamomile, honey, a hint of lemon. It was perfect. "I'm sorry about your husband," Bear said awkwardly, like he wasn't quite sure how to navigate this kind of conversation. "He sounds like a fool." Claire let out a broken laugh that was half sob. "He's worse than a fool. He made me believe I was the problem. For years, every time I questioned something, every time I noticed he was pulling away, he told me I was paranoid. That I was crazy." She stared into the tea, her reflection wavering on the surface. He made me think I was losing my mind for noticing the truth. Bear nodded slowly, his scarred hands resting on his knees. There's a word for that. Gaslighting. Read about it in prison. Claire's eyes snapped up. You read? In prison? Bear's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. Lady, I had 10 years. Not much else to do besides lift weights and read every book in the library. 10 years. Claire didn't ask what he'd been in for. Not yet, anyway. But the fact that he'd survived a decade in prison and come out the other side still capable of kindness said something about who he really was. The three-legged dog hobbled over and rested its head on Claire's knee, brown eyes looking up at her with pure adoration. That's Corporal, Bear said. Found him in a dumpster behind the shop 3 years ago. Some piece of trash had used him for fighting, then tossed him when he lost a leg. Claire's hand moved on instinct, scratching behind Corporal's ears, and the dog's tail resumed its enthusiastic wagging. You saved him, Claire said softly. Bear shrugged. He saved me right back. Gave me something to care about when I didn't care about much of anything. They sat in silence for a while, just the sound of rain hammering the roof and Corporal's happy panting filling the space. Claire felt warmth slowly returning to her body, the shaking subsiding, her mind beginning to clear from the fog of shock and hypothermia. You can stay as long as you need, Bear said finally. Guest rooms down the hall. Clean sheets. Lock on the door if it makes you feel safer. Claire looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something she hadn't expected to find in a man the world called a monster. Decency. Thank you, she whispered. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. Bear stood, unfolding to his full height, and for a moment the shadows made him look even more imposing. But then he smiled, a small, genuine smile that softened every hard edge on his face. You already did, he said. You trusted me when you had every reason not to. Claire woke up the next morning in a bed that wasn't hers, in a house that smelled like bacon and fresh coffee, and for a few blissful seconds she forgot where she was. Then it all came crashing back. Mark, the blonde, the rain, the lockout, Bear. She sat up, her body still sore from the cold, and noticed that someone had left clean clothes folded on the chair by the door. Sweatpants and a hoodie that were obviously way too big for her but looked warm and comfortable. Claire changed quickly, then ventured out into the hallway. The smell of breakfast was overwhelming now, and when she stepped into the kitchen she found Bear standing at the stove, flipping pancakes with surprising precision. He'd changed too. No leather cut this morning, just a faded Metallica t-shirt that strained against his massive shoulders and jeans that had seen better days. He looked less like a biker president and more like someone's protective older brother. Morning, Bear said without turning around. Hope you like pancakes. I ain't great at cooking, but I've got this recipe down. Claire slid into a chair at the kitchen table, moving aside a half-finished carving of a hawk. You made these? Yeah, helps me think. Keeps my hands busy. He plated the pancakes and set them in front of her, along with real maple syrup and butter. Eat, you're gonna need your strength today. For what? Claire asked. For going back and getting your stuff. Your phone, your wallet, your documents, all of it. Can't rebuild if you don't have the tools. Claire's stomach clenched. I can't go back there. Mark will. Mark will do exactly nothing, Bear said calmly, pouring himself coffee. Because I'm going with you. And trust me, lady, your husband ain't gonna try anything stupid when I'm standing there. Claire should have been terrified by the implication, by the barely veiled threat in Bear's words. But instead, she felt something she hadn't felt in 7 years. Safe. Anyway, they went back to the house that afternoon, and Claire's hands were shaking again as they pulled up in Bear's truck, a beat-up F-150 that looked like it had survived several apocalypses. Mark's car was in the driveway. The red sedan was gone. Bear parked and turned to Claire. You want me to go in first? Clear the way. Claire shook her head. No, I need to do this. She walked up to the front door, the same door that had been slammed in her face less than 24 hours ago, and used the spare key hidden under the flower pot to let herself in. Mark was in the living room, sprawled on the couch in his boxers, playing video games like nothing had happened. He looked up when Claire walked in, his expression cycling through surprise, then annoyance, then anger. What are you doing here? He demanded. I thought I made it clear. Then Bear stepped through the doorway behind Claire, ducking slightly to fit his massive frame through, and Mark's words died in his throat. His face went pale. Claire's here to get her things, Bear said pleasantly, like he was discussing the weather. You're gonna sit right there and not say a word while she does. We clear? Mark's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. I said, we clear? Bear repeated. his voice dropping an octave. Yeah, we're clear, Mark stammered. Claire walked past him without a word, heading upstairs to the bedroom where her life had imploded. The bed was unmade, sheets still tangled from yesterday's betrayal. Claire grabbed her suitcase from the closet and started packing. Clothes, toiletries, the photo albums of her parents that Mark had always hated, her laptop, her important documents. She was shoving her favorite books into a box when Mark appeared in the doorway, trying to look brave now that Bear wasn't standing right next to him. "Claire, come on," he said, his voice wheedling now, manipulative. "Don't be dramatic. We can work this out. I made a mistake, okay?" "It didn't mean anything." Claire paused, a book halfway into the box. "It didn't mean anything," she repeated slowly. "Exactly. See, you get it. So just unpack your stuff, and we can forget. This whole thing happened." "No, Mark." Claire turned to face him, and for the first time in 7 years, she looked at him without love, clouding her vision. "What I mean is, you don't mean anything. Not to me. Not anymore." Mark's face flushed red. "You're making a huge mistake. Nobody else is gonna want you. You're 32 years old, Claire. You're not exactly a catch." The old Claire would have flinched. The new Claire, the one who'd survived a rainstorm and been rescued by a monster, just smiled. "Good thing I'm not fishing anymore," she said. She grabbed her boxes and walked past Mark like he was furniture. Bear was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, and when he saw Claire loaded down with her life in cardboard boxes, he took them from her without a word and carried them to the truck. Mark followed them outside, desperation creeping into his voice now. "Claire, Claire, you really gonna choose some criminal over me? Some ex-con biker trash?" Bear paused at the truck, boxes still in his arms, and looked back at Mark. "I did 10 years for protecting my little sister from a man who wouldn't take no for an answer," he said calmly. "I'd do 20 more if I had to." "But you?" He shook his head. "You're the kind of man who throws his wife out in the rain because she caught you cheating. So yeah, I'm trash. But at least I know what I am." He loaded the boxes into the truck bed and opened the passenger door for Claire like she was royalty. Claire climbed in. She didn't look back at Mark. She didn't need to. That chapter was closed. As they drove away, Bear glanced over at her. "You okay?" Claire thought about it, really thought about it. She'd lost her husband, her home, her entire life as she knew it. But she'd gained something too. Her spine. "Yeah," she said, surprised to find she meant it. "I think I actually am." The weeks that followed were strange and wonderful, and nothing like Claire had expected. She stayed in Bear's guest room, paying rent by cooking dinner and helping with household chores, though Bear kept insisting she didn't need to pay him anything. But Claire needed to contribute, needed to feel useful, needed to prove to herself that she wasn't just some charity case. So she started helping around the auto shop too. At first, it was just answering the phone, scheduling appointments, greeting customers who walked in looking nervous because of all the leather-clad bikers working on cars. But then Claire started noticing things. The shop was bleeding money, not because the work was bad. Bear and his crew were incredible mechanics, the kind who could rebuild an engine blindfolded, but because Bear couldn't say no to anyone who needed help. "How much do we charge for a full transmission replacement?" Claire asked one afternoon, looking at the invoice board. Bear scratched his beard. "Depends. If they can pay, we charge market rate. If they can't, we work something out." "Work something out how?" "They bring us food sometimes, or help out around the shop, or just pay us when they can." Claire stared at him. "Bear, you can't run a business on good intentions and casserole." He shrugged. "These are our people, Claire. The ones the fancy shops turn away. We take care of our own." And that was beautiful. Truly it was. But it was also financial self-destruction. Claire spent that evening going through the shop's records, which were basically just receipts stuffed into a shoebox, and her accountant brain started screaming. The shop should have been making 6 figures a year. Instead, it was barely breaking even. "Can I ask you something?" Claire said the next morning over breakfast. "Shoot," Bear replied, focused on his pancakes. "Would you let me fix your books? Organize the business side of things? Set up a real system so you can actually make money without losing your soul?" Bear looked up, syrup dripping from his fork. "You do that? Bear, you gave me a home when I had nothing. Let me give you something back." He studied her for a long moment, those scarred eyes seeing more than she expected. "All right," he said finally, "but the boys aren't gonna like it. They're used to doing things their way." Claire smiled. A real smile, the kind she hadn't felt on her face in years. "Good thing I'm not afraid of bikers anymore." The Iron Kings took one look at Claire, this 5'4" woman in a cardigan holding a clipboard, and laughed. "Bear, you serious right now?" asked Chains, a massive biker with a beard even bigger than Bear's. "She's gonna tell us how to run our shop." She's gonna tell you how to run a business, Bear corrected. And you're gonna listen, or you're gonna answer to me. The laughter died. Claire stepped forward, refusing to be intimidated. Here's the thing, gentlemen. You're the best mechanics in Portland. People drive from 3 counties away to get their cars fixed here. But you're charging half of what you're worth, and you're letting people walk all over you. We help our community, rumbled Diesel, a quiet guy covered in motor oil. And that's beautiful, Claire said. Really? But helping your community doesn't mean destroying yourselves. We can do both. Help people and stay in business. But we need structure. We need policies. And we need you to stop accepting homemade cookies as payment for a break job. Chains crossed his arms. What if we don't want to change? Claire looked him dead in the eye. Then in 6 months, this shop closes, you all lose your jobs, and the community loses the only place that gives a damn about them. Your choice. The room went silent. Bear stood up from where he'd been leaning against the wall. You heard her. Claire's in charge of the business side now. She says it's cash or credit. It's cash or credit. She says we need appointments, we take appointments. Got it? Nobody argued with Bear. And honestly, nobody really wanted to argue with Claire either, because despite her size, she had a spine made of steel and eyes that said she'd survived worse than a room full of bikers. Over the next month, Claire transformed the shop. She set up a real accounting system. She created a sliding scale for payment so they could still help struggling families without bankrupting themselves. She hired a part-time receptionist so the bikers could focus on actual mechanical work. She even convinced them to clean up the waiting area and stop leaving greasy handprints on everything. The change was dramatic. Within 6 weeks, revenue doubled. Within 3 months, they had a waiting list. The Iron Kings went from that dangerous biker gang to the best shop in Portland that actually cares about people. And Claire? Claire went from a woman who'd been thrown away like trash to a woman who'd built something real. But more than the shop changed, Bear changed too. Claire started buying him shirts that weren't ripped or stained with oil. She taught him how to cook real meals instead of living on takeout and canned soup. She showed him that he could command respect without threatening people, that his presence alone was enough. You don't have to be scary to be strong, she told him one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Corporal snoring between them. Bear was quiet for a long moment, his massive hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. Nobody ever told me that before, he said finally. My whole life I thought the only way to survive was to be the biggest, meanest thing in the room. Claire looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the truth. Bear wasn't mean. He was just scared. Scared of being hurt, scared of being abandoned, scared of showing softness in a world that punished weakness. You're more than that, Claire said softly. You're kind. You're loyal. You're one of the best men I've ever met. Bear turned to her, his eyes shining with something that looked suspiciously like tears. You saved my life, Claire. You know that, right? She shook her head. No, Bear. You saved mine. And somewhere between the auto shop and the sunset and the 3-legged dog snoring on the porch, Claire realized something terrifying and wonderful. She was falling in love, not with the monster the world saw, but with the man she'd discovered underneath. 6 months after that rainy night, Claire stood in front of the bathroom mirror and barely recognized herself. Her hair was healthier, shining in a way it hadn't in years, because she wasn't spending every waking moment stressed about whether Mark would come home angry. Her eyes were brighter, no longer dull from constantly walking on eggshells. Her shoulders were back, her posture straight, because she'd stopped making herself small to fit into someone else's life. She looked like a woman who'd been drowning and finally remembered how to breathe. And tonight, Bear was taking her to dinner. Not a dive bar, not a pizza place where they ate standing up. A real restaurant, the kind with white tablecloths and a wine list, and servers who wore actual uniforms. Claire smoothed down the simple black dress she'd bought with her first real paycheck from managing the shop, and she felt something she hadn't felt in 7 years. Pride. She walked into the living room and found Bear standing by the door, looking absolutely uncomfortable in a button-down shirt she'd picked out for him last week. He was tugging at the collar like it was choking him, but he'd actually tucked the shirt in. And his beard was trimmed, and his hair was pulled back in a neat bun. He looked less like a terrifying biker president, and more like someone who could sit at a normal dinner table without making children cry. You clean up nice, Claire teased. Bear grumbled something under his breath, but she caught the smile tugging at his lips. Don't get used to it. This shirt feels like a straitjacket. You look handsome, Claire said, and she meant it. Bear's ears went red, and he cleared his throat awkwardly. You look beautiful. The way he said it, hesitant and honest, like he'd been working up the courage all day, made Claire's heart skip. They took Bear's truck to Giuseppe's, a steakhouse on the nice side of town where Claire had never been, because Mark always said it was too expensive and… Anyway, what was the point of wasting money on fancy food? But Bear held doors open for her. He pulled out her chair. He asked what she wanted to order, instead of just ordering for both of them. And when the server brought the wine list, Bear didn't pretend to know about wine. He just asked Claire what she preferred and ordered that. It was such a small thing, but it meant everything. I gotta say, Bear murmured as they waited for their food, I never thought I'd be the kind of guy sitting in a place like this. Why not? Claire asked. Look at me, Claire. I'm a convicted felon with prison tattoos and scars all over my face. People see me and cross the street. This ain't my world. Claire reached across the table and took his hand, those massive, scarred, gentle hands that had wrapped a jacket around her when she was dying in the rain. Then we'll make it your world, she said simply. You deserve nice things too, Bear. He looked at her like she'd just told him the sky was green. Like the concept of deserving good things had never occurred to him before. And maybe it hadn't. They talked through dinner about everything and nothing, about the shop's new contracts, about Corporal's latest adventure chasing a squirrel, about the wood carving Bear was working on that looked suspiciously like Claire's profile. Claire felt lighter than she had in years, like she was finally living instead of just surviving. And then, as they were leaving the restaurant, the door opened, and Claire's blood turned to ice. Mark. He looked terrible. Worse than terrible, actually. Dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in weeks. Clothes wrinkled and hanging off his frame like he'd lost weight. A haunted, hollow expression on his face that screamed of a man whose carefully constructed life had collapsed around him. Because it had. Claire would learn later, through mutual acquaintances she'd reconnected with, that the blonde had left Mark 3 weeks after Claire did. But she didn't just leave. She cleaned out his bank account first, maxed out his credit cards, and disappeared with a guy she'd been seeing on the side. Karma, it seemed, had excellent aim and a vicious sense of humor. Mark saw Claire. His eyes went wide, then wider, because Claire didn't look like the trembling, broken woman he'd thrown into the rain 6 months ago. She was glowing, healthy, confident. Her hair shone under the restaurant lights. Her smile was easy and genuine, and she was holding hands with a mountain of a man in a leather cut who looked like he could bench press a car. Claire? Mark's voice cracked like old glass. Claire stiffened, and immediately Bear felt it. His grip on her hand tightened, not in aggression, not in possessiveness, but in reassurance. A silent promise. I'm here. You're safe. Bear stepped slightly in front of Claire, not blocking her, but positioning himself as a wall of muscle and calm between her and the man who'd hurt her. Mark's eyes flicked to Bear, and fear flickered across his face before he masked it with false bravado. Who's this? Mark sneered, but his voice shook. Your bodyguard? I'm her husband, Bear said calmly. The word hung in the air like a bomb. Mark laughed, a nervous, desperate sound that had nothing to do with humor. Yeah, right. You're a convict, a criminal. He looked at Claire, desperation creeping into his voice like water through cracks. Claire, stop playing around. I'm willing to take you back. I need someone to manage the house. Cook, clean, the things you're good at. 6 months ago, those words would have cut Claire to the bone. They would have made her question herself, made her wonder if maybe she was being unreasonable, made her shrink back into the small, accommodating version of herself that Mark had trained her to be. But the old Claire was dead. She'd drowned in that rainstorm. And the new Claire, the one who'd rebuilt an auto shop and faced down a room full of bikers, and learned that her worth wasn't determined by whether someone chose to see it, felt something she'd never felt before when looking at Mark. Pity, because he was still exactly who he'd always been. Small, insecure, desperate to control because he couldn't create. Bear looked at Mark and studied him the way you might study a bug under glass, with clinical detachment and faint curiosity. The old Bear, the one who'd spent 10 years in prison and built his reputation on violence, would have broken Mark's nose right there in front of the restaurant. Would have made him beg for mercy. Would have taught him the kind of lesson that involved dental work and apologies. But the new Bear, the one Claire had helped build, the one who'd learned that strength didn't require violence, simply smiled. She's not a manager, pal, Bear said pleasantly. He leaned in, just slightly. Just enough for Mark to feel the difference in their sizes, to understand exactly how outmatched he was. She's a partner, and she's way out of your league. He straightened and turned to Claire, his entire demeanor shifting from intimidating to gentle in the space of a heartbeat. You ready to go home? Bear asked softly. Claire looked at Mark one last time. She saw him clearly now. Not through the lens of love or obligation or 7 years of manipulation. Just a small, sad man who'd mistaken control for connection and cruelty for strength. He looked pathetic standing there in his wrinkled clothes, trying to convince her to come back and clean his house. Then Claire looked at Bear, the man who had given her the coat off his back when she was nothing to him. The man who had sat on the floor so she wouldn't be scared. The man who had let her rebuild his entire world and rebuilt hers in return. The man who looked at her like she hung the moon instead of like she was an appliance that had stopped working properly. "Yes," Claire said, and her voice didn't shake at all. "Let's go home." She didn't look back at Mark. She didn't need to. That door was closed, locked, and she'd thrown away the key. As they walked to the truck, Bear's arm around her shoulders, Claire felt something settle in her chest. Peace. Not the fragile, temporary peace of avoiding conflict, but the deep, permanent peace of knowing exactly who you are and refusing to apologize for it. "Thank you," she said as they climbed into the truck. "For what?" Bear asked, starting the engine. "For not hitting him. I know you wanted to." Bear was quiet for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel. "Old me would have put him through a wall," he admitted. "But you taught me something, Claire. You taught me that the best revenge ain't violence. It's living well. Being happy. Showing them that they didn't break you." He glanced over at her, his scarred face soft in the dashboard lights. "And anyway, why would I waste my time on him when I could spend it with you?" Claire's eyes filled with tears. The good kind. The kind that come from being seen and valued and loved in ways you didn't know were possible. "I love you," she said. The words came out before she could stop them, but she didn't want to stop them because they were true, had been true for weeks now, and she was done hiding how she felt to make other people comfortable. Bear pulled the truck over to the side of the road. He turned to face her, his eyes searching hers like he was looking for the trick, the catch, the moment where she'd laugh and say she was kidding. "You sure about that?" he asked quietly. "Because I'm a lot, Claire. I've got a record. I've got enemies. I've got a past that make most people run screaming. I'm sure," Claire said firmly, "because you're also kind and loyal and brave. And you see me, really see me, not as someone to fix or manage or control, but as someone to build with." Bear's eyes went suspiciously shiny. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Have for months now. Just didn't think I had the right to say it." Claire laughed through her tears. "You have every right, you ridiculous man." Bear cupped her face in his massive hands, gentle as though she were made of glass, and kissed her. It wasn't their first kiss that had happened 3 weeks ago in the auto shop office, surrounded by invoices and the smell of motor oil, but it felt like a beginning anyway, like a promise, like coming home. They married 3 months later in the backyard of the little house behind the auto shop. It wasn't a fancy wedding. Claire had no interest in fancy anymore, had learned that the most beautiful things were often the simplest. String lights hung from the trees, casting warm golden light over everything. Wildflowers filled mason jars on every surface, picked that morning from the field behind the property. The 3-legged dog, Corporal, served as ring bearer, a velvet pillow strapped carefully to his collar, and he took his job very seriously. The Iron Kings stood in a row, leather cuts cleaned and pressed for once, looking like the world's most terrifying and touching wedding party. Chains cried openly. Diesel wore actual dress shoes instead of his usual boots. Even Rattlesnake, the club's enforcer who claimed he didn't have feelings, was dabbing at his eyes with a bandana. Bear wore a suit, a proper one, tailored to fit his massive frame by a seamstress who'd almost fainted when she saw him walk into her shop. But over the suit, he wore his leather cut, because that was who he was. A man with a past and a present, with scars and strength, with violence in his history and gentleness in his heart. And Claire loved him for all of it. She wore a simple white dress, nothing elaborate, because she'd learned that she didn't need a fairy tale wedding to have a fairy tale ending. She just needed the right person standing beside her. When it was time for the vows, Bear took Claire's hands in his, and his voice, so calm and steady in every other moment, began to shake. "I was a jagged rock," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "Sharp edges everywhere. Dangerous to touch. People crossed the street to avoid me, and I thought that was just how it was, how it would always be." He swallowed hard, his throat working. "But you didn't run. You didn't look at my scars and see a monster. You saw a man. A broken one. A messy one, but a man worth saving." His voice cracked, and several of the Iron Kings made sympathetic sounds. Half of them were crying now, these hardened bikers who'd seen every kind of violence and cruelty the world had to offer, reduced to tears by watching their president find love. "You taught me how to be worthy of a life," Bear finished, his eyes shining. "I don't know what I did to deserve you, but I'll spend every day trying to earn it." Claire reached up and touched his face, tracing the scars she'd memorized over months of falling asleep next to him. The one over his left eyebrow from a bar fight when he was 19. The one along his jaw from a knife in prison. The one on his cheekbone from protecting his sister. The reason he'd gone to prison in the first place. Each scar was a story, and Claire loved every single one. "And you taught me something too," Claire whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You taught me that the safest place in the world isn't a house with a locked door and a husband who pretends to love you." She smiled through her tears. "It's inside your jacket. In your arms. With someone who sees you as a partner, not a possession." Bear made a sound, half laugh, half sob, and pulled her into his arms the same way he had that rainy night 6 months ago. Like she was precious. Like she was his whole world. Like he'd protect her from anything and everything, including her own doubts. The efficient, a friend of Diesel's who'd gotten ordained online specifically for this wedding, cleared his throat. "By the power vested in me by the internet in the state of Oregon, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Bear, you may kiss your bride." The big bad wolf kissed his bride while the Iron Kings cheered, and Corporal barked joyously, and the string lights twinkled overhead like stars. And Claire realized something fundamental. She'd spent 7 years in a marriage that had felt like a prison, and she'd found freedom with a man who'd actually been in one. A year later, Claire stood in the office of Iron Kings Auto, the official name now, printed on business cards and everything, and smiled at the quarterly report in front of her. Revenue was up 40%. They'd hired 3 new mechanics. They'd expanded into the empty lot next door. And they'd started a non-profit program teaching underprivileged kids mechanic skills, because Bear insisted that everyone deserved a chance to build something with their hands. The door opened, and Bear walked in, covered in grease but grinning. "Mrs. Reed," he said. He loved calling her that. Loved the way her last name had changed to match his. "We just got a call from the mayor's office. They want to feature us in the city's small business spotlight." Claire laughed. "The same mayor who tried to shut you down 3 years ago?" "The very same." Bear crossed the office and wrapped his arms around her from behind, careful not to get grease on her clothes. "Funny how things change when you prove people wrong." Claire leaned back against his chest, feeling safe and solid and home. "We proved everyone wrong," she said. "They said you were just a criminal. They said I was just a doormat. They said this would never work." "And now?" Bear asked, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Now we're partners. In business and life. Building something real." Through the office window, Claire could see the shop floor. The Iron Kings were working, but they were different now. Professional, focused, proud of what they'd built together. Chains was teaching a teenager how to change oil. Diesel was carefully explaining engine diagnostics to a customer. Rattlesnake was actually smiling. They'd all transformed, but not by becoming something they weren't. By becoming the best versions of who they already were. Just like Bear. Just like Claire. "You know what I realized?" Claire said softly. "What's that?" "That night in the rain, when you stopped and offered me your jacket, you weren't just saving me from the storm." Bear turned her around to face him, his scarred hands gentle on her shoulders. "You were showing me what I'd been missing my whole life," Claire continued. "Not a perfect man. Not a man without a past. But a good man. A real one. Someone who'd choose me every single day, not because he owned me, but because he valued me." Bear's eyes went soft, the way they always did when she said things that touched the parts of him he usually kept hidden. "You saved me too, you know," he said quietly. "I was just going through the motions before you. Working, existing, not really living. You reminded me that I could be more than my mistakes." Claire stood on her tiptoes and kissed him, not caring that he was covered in grease. Not caring that they were in the office where anyone could see. Because this was love, not the fairy tale kind that looked pretty but felt empty. The real kind. The kind that saw all your scars and loved you harder because of them. The kind that said, "I choose you," every single morning and meant it. The kind that proved the monsters we're taught to fear are sometimes the ones who save us. And the homes we're locked out of were never really our homes at all. Fam, sometimes life locks you out of the wrong house so you can find your way to the right home. Claire thought she'd lost everything that rainy night. But what she really lost was the weight of living for someone who didn't deserve her. And Bear? He found something he thought men like him didn't get to have. A partner who saw past the scars to the heart underneath. If this story touched you, if you've ever felt thrown away and found yourself again, drop a comment and let me know. And hey, if you loved this journey from that rainstorm to that wedding, smash that subscribe button, because we've got more stories about people who refuse to stay broken. Remember, the strongest thing you can do isn't staying in the wrong place because you're scared. It's walking away and building something better. Even if it's raining, even if you're terrified, even if the person offering help looks nothing like what you expected. Sometimes the greatest love stories start with the worst endings. Until next time, fam, Stay strong, stay real, and never let anyone make you feel like you're not worth fighting for.